The moment Alicia Keys stepped onto the driveway, she realized she might have just walked into a trap. Her heels clicked against the gravel, sharp and impatient, but her mind was already racing. One wrong number in the address had led her to this estate, a fortress disguised as a house, surrounded by high gates and the quiet vigilance of armed guards. She clutched the envelope tightly, aware that what she carried could ruin careers, lives, even reputations. And yet, in that instant, a thrill she couldn't name pulsed through her. She had been trained to handle pressure, but never like this, where every shadow might conceal danger and every silence could conceal judgment. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. A security guard stepped out from the shadows, tall and immovable. He scanned the envelope once, twice, then gave a subtle nod, opening the gates with a soft, mechanical click. Alicia's heart raced. Why would they let a stranger in? The question lodged in her chest, refusing to let her forget that she was already inside a world she didn't belong in. The house itself was imposing. Angular stone walls, minimal windows, a driveway that curved like a question mark leading to a door that seemed to breathe with quiet authority. Alicia's fingers tightened on the envelope. Every instinct screamed for her to turn around, but the instructions she'd been given were precise. Deliver the documents, leave immediately. She would leave. She just needed to survive the walk to the door first. Then he appeared, Bryan Star. He opened the door personally. Not angry, not surprised, just measuring, calculating, a predator in a tailored suit whose gaze dissected every part of her in a single, measured sweep. Alicia froze. This was not someone to charm or negotiate with. This was someone who understood power and consequence in ways most people never would. She held out the envelope instinctively. He didn't take it. He didn't even acknowledge the error in the address. Instead, he studied her. The silence between them stretched, taut as a wire. Alicia felt it in her chest, in her stomach, in the tremor she couldn't quite control. The air in the entrance hall seemed to hum with his presence, an unspoken promise of danger, intrigue, and something she couldn't yet name. Her body reacted against her mind, a strange fluttering, a recognition of risk and attraction both. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, smooth, precise, carrying authority that didn't need to raise volume. "You were meant to be somewhere else," he said. "Yes," Alicia replied, steady, almost defiant despite the knot of adrenaline tightening in her chest. I'm here by mistake. I need to." She stopped. His head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to remind her that she wasn't in control. He was assessing her, weighing her presence, measuring her response like a man who had spent years learning to read every detail. For a moment she considered fleeing. The gates behind her beckoned like a promise of safety, but something in the depth of his gaze held her, an unspoken challenge, a dangerous invitation. She realized she had two choices: walk away now or step further into a world where the rules were not hers to write. The envelope was still in her hands, but suddenly it felt meaningless. She had delivered the documents, yes, but it was her presence that mattered now, her choice. Her fingers brushed the paper one last time before she nodded subtly. She stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the retreat she had once considered. She had crossed the threshold. And from the first moment inside, she knew nothing would ever be the same. The door clicked shut behind her, a sound that resonated like a verdict. Alicia's pulse had yet to settle, her palms still slick against the envelope she held loosely. The interior of the house was deceptively simple: clean lines, muted colors, an absence of any unnecessary decoration. But it carried the weight of deliberate precision. Every detail whispered control, discipline, wealth refined to a quiet, almost oppressive perfection. Alicia realized immediately that she was in a place where every corner had a purpose, every silence a meaning. Bryan Star did not move from the threshold. He held the envelope in his hand now, letting it rest lightly against his palm as if it were both fragile and lethal at the same time. He did not glance at her, did not offer a greeting, and yet the energy between them had already thickened into something almost physical. Alicia's senses sharpened. She felt the faint warmth of his presence before noticing the subtle scent of cedar and something darker, spice, leather, and a trace of musk that made her stomach tighten. He finally spoke, but his words were not formal, not accusatory. They were careful, deliberate, and carried a weight that suggested awareness far beyond hers. "Do you understand what this is?" Alicia froze for a fraction of a second. The envelope had only seemed like documents meant to cross hands. Now under his gaze, it felt like something alive, dangerous, and almost forbidden. "Yes," she said carefully, her voice even though her heart was hammering. She faltered. She didn't lie, but she didn't elaborate. Not yet. He regarded her like a sculptor studying marble, eyes narrowing slightly, reading her tone, her posture, the tiny twitch of her fingers around the envelope. She realized suddenly that she was not a guest in this room, she was an experiment, a puzzle he was slowly unraveling. Her body reacted instinctively, the taut line of her back, the flush along her neck. This man did not need to touch her to assert control. Every glance, every measured shift in his stance sent signals she could not ignore. "I need to see them," he said, and finally extended a hand. Alicia hesitated, aware that surrendering the envelope was symbolic. She handed it over slowly, feeling the friction of her fingers against his. The contact was brief, but it sent a flicker of awareness up her spine. The papers were now in his possession, but the unspoken tension lingered, thicker than any fabric in the room. Bryan examined the documents with quiet precision, his eyes scanning each page, his brow occasionally furrowing, the subtle flex of his jaw betraying thought and calculation. Alicia took a cautious step back, thinking her role ended here. She expected the next move to be a brusque dismissal, a curt gesture to leave. But he did not. Instead, Bryan Star studied her, this time more deliberately, and she realized something she hadn't considered before. He already knew she had delivered them by mistake. This wasn't about the envelope anymore. It was about her. "I can't let you leave just yet," he said quietly. There was no anger in his tone, only a certainty that left no room for argument. Alicia's stomach tightened. She felt exposed, both professionally and personally. The power in this room was not just his wealth or influence. It was the quiet, almost predatory precision with which he held the space, the moment, and her. She remained still, allowing herself a deep inhale, the scent of his cologne, or was it the room itself, filling her senses, making her acutely aware of every subtle movement between them. She had delivered documents she wasn't supposed to see, and yet he hadn't called security, hadn't demanded explanations beyond her immediate responses. He was calculating, waiting, watching. Alicia realized she was standing on a precipice. One wrong word, one wrong move, and the fragile equilibrium would shatter. And yet, something in the way he moved, the measured calm of his voice, the intensity of his gaze, made her acutely aware of another tension, an unspoken, almost sensual pull that she could not dismiss. She felt it in the low hum of her pulse, the warmth creeping across her skin, the subtle hitch of her breath when their eyes met just a fraction too long. Bryan placed the envelope down on a nearby surface, his fingers brushing against the leather of the desk in a deliberate, unhurried motion. He leaned slightly forward, the faintest tilt of his body that was almost imperceptible but charged with intent. Alicia's mind raced, trying to compartmentalize professionalism from instinct. Every nerve in her body screamed in awareness of him, and she realized that leaving this room was no longer simply a matter of walking out. She was under scrutiny in a way that was dangerous, thrilling, and undeniably magnetic. Finally, Bryan's eyes lifted to hers, and the first trace of a question hung between them, not verbal but unmistakable in its weight. How much did she know? How aware was she of the consequences of a single misstep? Alicia's mind grasped for an answer, but her body and instinct spoke first. She could not, would not look away. And in that instant, it became clear. The documents were irrelevant. The mistake was irrelevant. What mattered was the unspoken understanding that she had stepped into a space controlled entirely by him, and that he had already decided she was worth observing, worth testing, worth noticing. Alicia's chest tightened as she lingered in the stillness of the room. The envelope now rested on the polished desk between them, yet it seemed less important than the weight of his gaze, which had not once faltered. Bryan Star did not speak again immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, a deliberate, controlled tension that made her heart hammer in her chest and her thoughts spin in a dizzying blur. He didn't need to raise his voice, or gesture, or threaten. His presence alone was authority incarnate, testing her reactions without words. She had delivered something she wasn't supposed to see, and he already knew it. The realization pressed against her mind, but she refused to let it show. Her instincts screamed that one wrong flicker of emotion, one misstep, could undo her in an instant. But she was trained for pressure. Alicia had navigated crises, temperamental clients, and high-stakes deals before. She could navigate this too, if she kept her composure. Bryan moved then, slowly, deliberately, crossing the room with the measured grace of someone who had learned to command every inch of the space he occupied. He picked up a single page from the envelope, turned it in his hands, and let his eyes linger over it just long enough to make Alicia feel as though she were under a microscope. The subtle crease of his brow, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jawline communicated volumes. He was not just reading the document, he was reading her. Alicia's mind raced, aware that every heartbeat, every subtle shift in posture was under his scrutiny. She recognized the test for what it was. He wanted to measure her intellect, her instincts, her composure under pressure. The situation was more than professional. It was intimate, a silent conversation of observation and reaction that neither of them spoke aloud. She could feel the pull of his presence, the subtle electricity that traced along the nerve endings of her skin whenever his eyes met hers. He placed the page down carefully, then leaned slightly against the edge of the desk, arms folded. It was a small, almost casual gesture, yet it radiated power. Alicia's gaze flicked from his face to the envelope and back, trying to read him as he had read her. She felt the tension coil tighter in her chest, aware that every second stretched longer than it should. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, almost tangible, an invisible force that made her pulse quicken. Bryan's voice finally cut through, low, calm, and deliberate. "Why are you here?" he asked. Not accusatory, not angry, simply measuring. It was a question loaded with multiple layers, intent, awareness, and the unspoken consequences of one wrong answer. Alicia's mind raced, weighing every possible response. She could explain the mistake, but phrasing mattered. Any hint of fear, hesitation, or uncertainty could betray her. "I was instructed to deliver these documents," she said carefully, her tone steady. "There was an error in the address. I corrected it as best I could." Her words were simple, neutral, but she felt the subtle tension tighten with every syllable, the unspoken understanding that he knew more than she did. Bryan nodded slightly, just enough to indicate acknowledgement without revealing anything. He studied her, his gaze sharp, unflinching, as though he were mapping her very presence, cataloging her reactions, measuring her limits. Alicia felt it all, his control, his precision, the quiet dominance in the way he occupied the space. And yet beneath the scrutiny there was an undeniable allure. The way he regarded her, deliberate and unhurried, sent an unfamiliar warmth through her body, the kind that made her hyper-aware of her own pulse, her breathing, the faint rise and fall of her chest. Alicia realized this was more than a test of professional acumen. It was a test of her instincts, her capacity to remain composed, to navigate the unspoken currents of power and attraction swirling around her. She had entered a world where subtle gestures carried weight, where a glance could communicate judgment, desire, or threat, and she knew that survival depended on reading the signs correctly. Every twitch of his mouth, every tilt of his head, every movement of his hands became a code she had to decipher. Bryan finally stepped closer, the sound of his polished shoes quiet but deliberate against the floor. The distance between them was measured, controlled, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, but far enough that it demanded awareness. Alicia's breath hitched imperceptibly. The sensation was not fear. It was a deep, instinctual alertness that mingled caution with a recognition of danger, attraction, and unspoken challenge. He gestured subtly toward the envelope. "Do you understand the implications of these documents?" His tone carried authority, but also curiosity. Alicia's eyes met his, steady, refusing to betray her racing thoughts. She knew that acknowledging the mistake was one thing. Revealing the depth of her understanding could be dangerous. "Yes," she said firmly, the single word carefully measured, enough to convey awareness without overconfidence. Bryan's gaze softened fractionally, just enough to make her feel the faintest brush of reassurance, then snapped back to precision, reminding her of the stakes. She sensed the layers in his observation, the professional assessment, the personal curiosity, the quiet, almost magnetic tension between them. Every detail of his presence was a statement. He was in control, he was assessing, and she was being evaluated not just for skill, but for composure, intelligence, and subtle resilience. For a long moment, they remained like that, two people suspended in the quiet energy of the room, the envelope a silent witness to the unspoken game unfolding. Alicia felt her own body respond. Heightened senses, the faint pulse at her temples, awareness of every inch of space between them, the subtle rhythm of proximity and distance. It was a slow, electric tension that refused to be named, one that existed entirely outside of words, yet carried every ounce of intimacy the human mind could recognize. Then, just as subtly as it had begun, Bryan straightened, stepping back and gestured toward the door. The unspoken verdict hung in the air. She was competent, she was composed, and she had passed the first measure of his scrutiny. Alicia exhaled slowly, though she knew this was only the beginning. The test had shifted, grown larger, more intricate, and she felt the quiet thrill of the challenge ripple through her. Every step she had taken tonight, the wrong address, the gate, the envelope, had brought her to this moment. And she now understood. She was no longer merely a messenger. She was part of something larger, something dangerous, and something undeniably compelling. Alicia Keys exited the estate with the same careful composure she had maintained inside, but the instant the gates closed behind her, the calm she tried to summon fractured. Her pulse was still racing, each beat a reminder that she had just stepped into a sphere of power and scrutiny far beyond her usual world. The gravel crunched beneath her heels, echoing louder than it should, as though each sound recorded and amplified her intrusion. She had delivered the documents, yes, but the encounter with Bryan Star had left a residue she could not shake, a feeling that she was no longer simply a courier, a neutral participant, but a player in a game whose rules she did not yet understand. The street was nearly empty, but she could not shake the sensation of being watched. A sleek black sedan slowed as she approached the corner. It was unremarkable in any other context, but the timing, the precise distance it maintained, and the unhurried stare from the driver's side window made her chest tighten. Her instincts screamed caution. She considered turning down another street, but the vehicle adjusted its path subtly, keeping pace without making any direct approach. It was not an accident. Her phone buzzed, a message from her firm confirming the delivery, but the screen had flickered just before the notification appeared, as though a shadow had passed over the device. A subtle glitch, easily dismissed, but in her heightened state of awareness, it was another thread in a web she could feel but not yet see. Every instinct in her body told her that the encounter at the estate had not ended with the closing of the gates. Bryan Star did not need to follow. He did not need to speak. His presence lingered in a way that was almost tangible, a calculated gravity that bent reality to its orbit. Walking faster, Alicia glanced behind her, careful not to appear obvious, and noted the sedan's position. The vehicle's patience, its controlled presence, suggested surveillance, but by whom? And why? Her mind raced through possibilities, every scenario sharper, darker, more dangerous than the last. She could not know for certain if this was protection, a warning, or a threat, but the fact that her thoughts circled inevitably back to Bryan Star made it clear. He was at the center of it all, whether she wanted to acknowledge it or not. By the time she reached her apartment, the adrenaline that had been simmering in her veins had not dissipated. She leaned against the door, inhaling sharply, trying to separate rational thought from the heat that Bryan's presence had stirred inside her. It was a dangerous awareness, the kind that awakened senses she did not know could respond so intensely. Her body remembered the weight of his gaze, the subtle warmth of the space he occupied, the almost imperceptible electricity that traced across her skin whenever their eyes had met. The memory was immediate, visceral, and impossible to dismiss. For the rest of the evening, subtle disturbances followed her. The light on her balcony flickered briefly. The faint hum of a car idling nearby became a chorus of imagined and real threats, and her phone buzzed intermittently, each notification stirring the same tightening in her chest. She knew instinctively that someone, or something, was monitoring her, though there was no overt action, no confrontation. The threat was unspoken, invisible, yet inescapably real. And yet beneath the anxiety, a different current flowed. Alicia recognized, almost against her better judgment, the thrill threaded through the tension, the draw toward the very man who commanded the unseen gravity in her life. Bryan Star's presence was a paradox, simultaneously unsettling and magnetic. She could feel him in the memory of the room, in the faint echo of his voice, in the way her senses continued to respond long after she had left. It was adult tension in its most exquisite form, dangerous, intoxicating, and entirely uncontainable. Sleep came fitfully, dreams a kaleidoscope of the evening's encounters. The envelope resting on his desk, the taut line of his jaw, the subtle scent lingering in her memory, the quiet challenge in his eyes. She woke in the middle of the night with her skin tingling, heart racing, her fingers brushing the sheets as if she could recall his touch in the absence of physical contact. The documents were supposed to be mundane, procedural, simple, but they had brought her into the orbit of a man whose presence was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Alicia noticed a new detail. Her car had a faint smudge on the handle, something that could have been overlooked, but in her heightened awareness, it felt deliberate. Someone had been close enough to leave it. She felt a shiver that was part alarm, part reluctant excitement, a dangerous blend she could neither fully accept nor dismiss. Bryan Star did not need to be physically present for his influence to be felt. It was in the subtlety of observation, the quiet gravity of his control, and the unspoken fact that she was now visible to someone who could affect far more than her career. Everywhere she went that day, her awareness sharpened. A colleague's glance, a distant car, the flicker of a reflection in a window. Her mind cataloged each anomaly. Her instincts, honed through years of navigating high-pressure environments, were now heightened by the electric, almost sensual awareness that she had encountered a man who operated entirely on observation, calculation, and unspoken power. She was aware that the pull she felt toward him was dangerous, that it could compromise her judgment, yet she could not deny it, nor would she allow herself to. By the evening, the tension had settled into a slow, persistent hum in her veins. She realized she was no longer merely a courier or a consultant delivering documents. She had entered a space where the presence of Bryan Star dominated not just a room, but her consciousness. The unspoken threat followed her like a shadow, a constant reminder that danger and desire often shared the same pulse. And she knew, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that this was only the beginning. The office smelled of polished wood and coffee, but the air was charged with a different energy the moment Alicia Keys stepped into the building. She had tried to compartmentalize the events at Bryan Star's estate, to convince herself that the wrong address, the subtle threat, and the lingering tension were contained within that night. But as she approached the elevator, the weight of awareness pressed down on her chest again. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from recognition. She was about to collide with the man whose presence had haunted her since that evening. Bryan Star's influence in the company was pervasive, though rarely overt. He rarely appeared in person, preferring to operate through the precise orchestration of his subordinates, his decisions moving like unseen currents through every project he touched. Alicia had known of him by reputation, a man of remarkable intellect, disciplined to the edge of obsession, someone whose approval could open doors or close them permanently. But she had not anticipated that the first project she would be consulting on, after the misdelivered documents, would be directly under his authority. She entered the conference room and the shift in atmosphere was instantaneous. Her colleagues straightened, voices lowered, subtle glances exchanged. Bryan was there, seated at the head of the table, not formally introduced, yet instantly commanding. His presence was magnetic, almost gravitational. He didn't rise, didn't acknowledge her verbally, but Alicia felt the weight of his gaze sweep across her. She did not flinch. She could not. Professionalism demanded composure, but her body betrayed her in small ways. A slight hitch of breath, a subtle tightening of her grip on her portfolio, the careful cadence of her steps as she approached her seat. He did not speak. He did not need to. The air between them carried a tension that was both thrilling and dangerous, a silent assertion that he remembered her, that he had already catalogued every nuance of her behavior, every reaction, every flicker of hesitation. Alicia could sense the unspoken acknowledgement in his gaze. He knew she had delivered the documents by mistake, and he had not forgiven, condemned, or dismissed her. He had observed. And now, without a word, the collision of their professional and personal worlds had begun. The meeting commenced, a discussion of deliverables, timelines, and critical decisions. Alicia presented her insights with precision, her mind honed to anticipate questions and challenges. Yet she was acutely aware of his eyes following her every movement. It was not scrutiny alone, it was calculation. Every word she spoke, every subtle inflection was noted, weighed, and assessed. He did not interject, did not correct, did not reveal opinion. But Alicia felt the invisible hand of his authority pressing on her, directing her even in absence. Her colleagues barely noticed the undercurrent between them, but Alicia could feel it with each breath. The unspoken tension, the subtle draw that reminded her of the estate, of the danger, of the intensity she had first encountered. She caught a glimpse of his fingers, resting lightly on the table, the faint flex of muscle as he leaned slightly forward. The motion was insignificant to anyone else, but to Alicia, it radiated controlled energy, a predator coiled and aware, capable of unleashing judgment or approval with equal ease. She finished her portion of the discussion, and the room exhaled as the meeting transitioned to logistical matters. Yet the collision of their worlds did not end there. As the room cleared, Bryan finally approached. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. He stopped at a measured distance, close enough to convey presence, far enough to maintain command. His gaze fixed on her with deliberate intensity, assessing, weighing, testing. Alicia held her posture, exhaling slowly, aware of the subtle rise in temperature along her spine. She understood instinctively that his attention was not casual. This was a man accustomed to control, yet intrigued by her, by the way she navigated pressure, by the precision in her mind and body, by the awareness that she was not a passive participant. He finally spoke, quietly, almost a murmur meant only for her. "You handled that well." The words were simple, minimal, yet laden with meaning. They were both acknowledgement and subtle challenge. Alicia's lips pressed together to hold back the flicker of reaction, but her heart betrayed her, skipping with recognition of approval she had not expected, and a thrill she could not dismiss. His presence, so authoritative, so controlled, was suffused now with the quiet, almost magnetic pull that had haunted her since the estate. For the remainder of the day, the tension followed her. Emails she sent were read with a speed and accuracy that suggested direct oversight. Her phone buzzed with terse confirmations and approvals that bore the unmistakable stamp of his involvement. Everywhere she turned, she felt the gravity of his scrutiny, the silent challenge in his observation, and the adult awareness of attraction she could neither ignore nor control. By evening, Alicia found herself outside the office, hands brushing against the leather strap of her bag as she tried to steady her racing pulse. She realized that the collision was not merely professional. The encounter at work had layered their connection with intrigue, tension, and an unspoken awareness of danger, mixed now with an undeniable attraction. Bryan Star was no longer just a distant authority. He was here, present, and aware. And she knew, in the quiet beat of her pulse, that this was only the beginning of a game whose rules she had yet to understand, and whose stakes were far higher than she could have anticipated. The office had emptied, leaving Alicia alone in the conference room, surrounded by the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the subtle echo of her heels against the polished floor. She had just finished reviewing the final set of project proposals, but her mind wasn't on work. Every decision she made, every word she had spoken under Bryan Star's watchful gaze earlier in the day, still played in her head like a taut string vibrating with tension. The collision at work had been more than professional. It had been a subtle, intricate dance where intellect, presence, and an unspoken attraction intertwined, leaving her body and mind aware in ways she hadn't anticipated. She heard the soft click of the door before she realized it was opening. Bryan stepped in, his movements measured, deliberate, carrying the same quiet authority that had unsettled and intrigued her from their first encounter. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he leaned against the edge of the table, fingers brushing lightly along the polished wood, eyes fixed on her with the same intensity she had learned to recognize, evaluative, magnetic, and increasingly personal. Alicia met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch. But the subtle warmth radiating from him, the pull that tightened her chest and made her pulse hitch, reminded her how intimately aware her body was of his presence. He had not reached for her, had not touched her, yet every movement carried weight, a deliberate tension that left her acutely aware of proximity, of control, and of desire contained within careful boundaries. "You handled that crisis well today," he said, finally breaking the silence. The words were quiet, almost understated, but they carried the full force of acknowledgement and recognition. Alicia's stomach fluttered. It was the first time he had allowed a personal assessment to slip into their professional space, subtle yet intentional. "Thank you," she replied, her voice measured but not without awareness of the pull in the room. Every syllable seemed to stretch longer than it should, every inhale conscious, every shift of weight deliberate. She could feel his gaze tracking her, assessing not just competence but composure, presence, and the unspoken resonance between them. He pushed off the table lightly, closing the distance by a few measured steps. "I've seen many handle pressure. You approach it differently, with clarity, poise, and an awareness most lack. That's rare." His tone was neutral, yet something deeper lingered beneath it, a subtle admission of personal intrigue, a vulnerability hidden under layers of control. Alicia's fingers flexed against the leather of her portfolio. She realized she was caught in a delicate balance, aware of the tension, drawn to it, yet cautious not to give him the satisfaction of reading her reaction too easily. She felt the subtle heat along her skin, the way her pulse responded to his proximity, the small hitch in her breath when he tilted his head slightly, observing, measuring, evaluating. For a long moment, neither spoke. The quiet stretched, charged with electricity, the kind that existed in the space between two adults aware of mutual attraction and danger, both conscious of the risks and the rewards. Alicia recognized that what she felt was not simple curiosity. It was adult, deliberate awareness, the kind that sharpened every sense, made every gesture significant, and left her acutely conscious of his presence even without contact. Then he did something unexpected. Bryan exhaled slowly, a subtle human gesture that softened the rigid edges of his authority. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to reveal that beneath the controlled exterior was someone who had cultivated walls so carefully that even small cracks were significant. "I've avoided distractions," he said, carefully measured, "for years. I didn't expect to notice someone like you." The words sent a ripple through Alicia's chest, not because they were a confession in the traditional sense, but because they revealed a sliver of humanity behind the precision, power, and control he exuded. For the first time, she saw the man behind the aura of authority, not vulnerable in the way of weakness, but vulnerable in the way of genuine awareness, of recognition, of choice. Her own awareness shifted subtly. She felt drawn to him, a dangerous, intoxicating pull that was both thrilling and unnerving. Her body responded instinctively, skin prickling, pulse racing, attention narrowing to the subtle movements of his presence. Yet her mind remained sharp, analyzing, parsing the implications. This was not a man to be seduced lightly. Every interaction, every acknowledgement, every pause carried consequence, and the stakes were real. Bryan's eyes softened fractionally, just enough for her to see the internal conflict, the struggle between control and interest, authority and desire. Alicia understood that this was an unspoken negotiation of power, tension, and the first stirrings of connection. She could feel the heat of it, the slow burn that neither had dared to name, the subtle awareness that boundaries existed but were deliberately tested by proximity, presence, and mutual recognition. Finally, he stepped back, creating a deliberate space between them. The tension lingered, a slow, simmering current that promised more, demanded awareness, and left her mind and body impossibly alert. Alicia exhaled softly, realizing she had passed the first unspoken test, not just of skill or composure, but of perception, awareness, and the quiet acknowledgement of something neither of them could yet name. As he turned to leave, she felt the room empty in a way it hadn't before. The subtle pull remained, lingering like a shadow, leaving her conscious of every sensation he had awakened, the anticipation, the awareness, the almost dangerous recognition of attraction that existed alongside professional respect. She understood with clarity, this was only the beginning. And the beginning, she realized, was far more complicated, more thrilling, and far more intimate than she had imagined. The office was unusually quiet that morning. Alicia Keys entered, expecting the hum of computers and soft chatter of her colleagues, but a thick tension pressed down on her as if the air itself had changed. Phones buzzed with urgent messages, whispered conversations ceased the moment she approached, and even the hum of the HVAC seemed sharper, more insistent. Something had shifted overnight. Her inbox was flooded with emails marked urgent or for review, but the subject lines made her blood run cold. Project mismanagement, confidential breach, immediate clarification required. Alicia's stomach churned. She scanned the messages and the truth hit her. Some damaging rumor had spread overnight, accusing her of mishandling sensitive information. The documents she had delivered, already complicated by the wrong address, were now at the center of whispered scrutiny, and the eyes of everyone around her carried curiosity, judgment, and suspicion. Her first instinct was to call Bryan Star, but she hesitated. He had not contacted her since the estate, since the subtle acknowledgement of her capability, and the thought of reaching out felt fraught with risk. Would he intervene? Would he condemn her? She could almost feel the weight of his unseen presence in the office, though he had not made himself known. Alicia tried to maintain composure. She moved between meetings, responding with poise, carefully answering questions and defending her work with the precision that had earned her recognition from Bryan. But the whispers were relentless, the glances unmistakable, and a subtle fear began to creep in. Had someone deliberately set her up, or was this a coincidence? Either possibility was dangerous. By mid-morning, she noticed a familiar presence across the office floor. Bryan Star had arrived. Not formally, not announced. He simply appeared, moving with quiet authority, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on her. The unspoken tension between them had transformed. It was no longer just attraction or curiosity. It was power, influence, and the subtle assertion that he could affect the outcome of the storm swirling around her. She met his eyes, steadying herself, refusing to show the panic that had started to creep into her expression. He did not approach immediately, did not offer words of reassurance, and that absence spoke volumes. Alicia felt the weight of his judgment, the careful measurement of her presence, and the quiet question it posed. Could she withstand the scrutiny, the pressure, the risk, and still maintain herself? The day dragged on in a blur of meetings, whispered conversations, and subtle glares. The rumor had spread not just within her department but across the company. Documents she had worked on, handled with care, were now scrutinized, dissected, and publicly questioned. Alicia's mind raced, tracking every potential source, every possible angle of attack. Her instincts screamed that someone had orchestrated this, someone with knowledge of her work and access to her vulnerabilities. Yet even in the midst of professional chaos, she could feel him, the magnetic pull of Bryan's presence, an undercurrent threading through every moment. He moved through the office with deliberate precision, observing, assessing, but not intervening. Every glance, every measured pause reminded her that he was aware, fully aware, yet withholding action. That restraint unsettled her more than the rumor itself. Was he protecting her or testing her? Was this another layer of the subtle game they had begun at the estate, or a new level of danger she could not yet measure? By late afternoon, Alicia could no longer ignore the scrutiny. Her team looked to her for guidance, colleagues avoided her gaze, and the tension coiled tighter in her chest. She knew she had to act decisively. Gathering her courage, she requested a private meeting with her manager, presenting a meticulous account of her handling of the documents, timelines, and communications. Every word was deliberate, precise, professional. Yet as she spoke, her mind kept returning to him, Bryan Star, the man who had seen her navigate pressure, who had tested her composure, who had sparked a fire she could neither control nor ignore. Hours passed and the rumor persisted, but Alicia's defense had bought her time. That evening, as she prepared to leave the office, she noticed him waiting near the exit. His presence was calm, controlled, and yet undeniably magnetic. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he studied her, measuring the subtle tension in her posture, the awareness in her eyes, the quiet resilience she had shown all day. Finally, he spoke, low, deliberate, and meant only for her. "You handled that well," he said, echoing words similar to those he had offered before. But this time the meaning was heavier, layered with recognition of both her professional skill and the personal stakes she had navigated. Alicia's breath hitched imperceptibly. She realized that he had observed everything, that his assessment had been constant, silent, and precise. And that awareness, that quiet intervention of presence, had protected her in ways words could not. She wanted to ask if he had orchestrated the rumor, if he had defended her, if he had watched over her for reasons beyond the professional. But she knew better than to speak impulsively. Instead, she allowed the tension to linger, the magnetic pull between them intensified by the trials of the day. As she stepped outside into the evening air, the city lights reflected off her briefcase, off the glass of the building, and she felt the subtle heat of his attention still lingering. The rumor had tested her, exposed vulnerabilities she had tried to contain, and revealed the unspoken layers of danger, intrigue, and attraction that Bryan Star represented. And in that moment, Alicia understood something vital. Whatever the rumor had been, whatever the stakes, he had already shaped the outcome without speaking a word. His actions, or his deliberate inaction, spoke louder than any declaration could. She had survived the leak, yes, but she had also survived the test of his presence, and she was acutely aware that the slow-burn tension between them was far from extinguished. The morning air felt heavier than usual when Alicia Keys arrived at the office. The rumor that had threatened to dismantle her credibility days ago now hung in the balance, unspoken but palpable, like a storm waiting to break. Her steps were deliberate, measured, each movement conscious of the subtle awareness she had developed under the weight of Bryan Star's observation. She had navigated the pressure of professional scrutiny and the threat of public judgment, but she had yet to uncover the truth behind the chaos. Bryan's presence was immediate, though understated. He did not announce himself. He did not step into her path or interrupt her morning routine. Instead, he moved through the office with quiet precision, every glance calculated, every pause intentional. Alicia felt the gravity of his attention, a reminder that he had not only witnessed the fallout but had quietly orchestrated a response beneath the surface. The documents, the rumor, the insinuations, all had been observed, measured, and catalogued in his mind. She tried to focus on work, reviewing proposals and coordinating with her team, but every movement, every subtle sound reminded her of him. Her pulse fluttered not from fear this time, but from the anticipation of knowing he would act soon, and from the magnetic awareness that he had already begun to shape the outcome of the day and her career, without a word. It was during a meeting that the first concrete sign appeared. One of the senior managers, usually meticulous and cautious, received a discreet notification from Bryan. The subtle tension shifted instantly. Alicia noticed the man's posture stiffen, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he masked it with practiced neutrality. It was a small signal, but in the controlled environment of the office, it carried enormous weight. Bryan had begun uncovering the source of the sabotage. Later that afternoon, Alicia was called into a private conference room. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Bryan was already there, seated with a composed calm that masked an intensity she had come to recognize as precise and calculated. On the desk between them were documents, emails, logs, and evidence meticulously compiled, clearly pointing to the real culprit, a rival seeking to destabilize both Bryan's project and Alicia's professional credibility. He didn't speak immediately, allowing her to absorb the truth, the delicate revelation that vindicated her yet exposed the depths of the professional games at play. Alicia's breath caught. The subtle satisfaction of justice was tempered by the acknowledgement of how close she had come to ruin, and by the stark awareness of how carefully Bryan had been orchestrating protection without her knowledge. "I've traced the source," he said finally, his voice low, deliberate, carrying authority and calm. "This person was attempting to sabotage both the project and your reputation. The leak was intentional, crafted to provoke instability. It is now contained." Alicia studied him, noting the controlled precision in his demeanor, the almost imperceptible signs of focus and calculation. The revelation settled heavily on her, yet a part of her chest lifted in relief. The danger that had shadowed her for days was neutralized, not by chance, not by coincidence, but by his deliberate, careful intervention. "Why didn't you say anything before?" she asked softly, the question barely audible but layered with emotion, frustration, relief, and curiosity. Bryan's eyes met hers, the same intensity she had felt since the estate, tempered now with a subtle acknowledgement of connection. "Because this was never about intervention. It was about understanding who you are, how you respond, and what you are capable of under pressure," he replied. His words were measured, but Alicia felt the underlying weight. He had watched, assessed, and protected, all while maintaining the precise control that defined him. The tension between them shifted subtly. It was no longer just professional scrutiny or threat. It carried a layer of intimacy that Alicia had not yet allowed herself to name. The controlled environment, the slow-burn awareness, the subtle acknowledgement of attraction, all coalesced in the quiet space between them. She realized that the man who had silently protected her had also been observing her resilience, intellect, and composure, and that awareness had sparked something in him that neither had yet confronted openly. Bryan leaned back slightly, the motion deliberate yet casual, as if testing the boundaries of their interaction. "Your handling of the situation demonstrated clarity, poise, and a capacity to navigate danger without panic," he said. The subtle praise, layered with acknowledgement of her professional skill and the personal stakes she had navigated, made her pulse quicken. Every word carried unspoken weight, admiration, recognition, and a quiet, simmering tension that neither dared to define fully. Alicia realized then that the reveal was more than just professional vindication. It was a turning point in their dynamic. She had been tested, observed, and subtly protected, and she understood with clarity that the slow, dangerous pull she felt toward Bryan was no accident. The stakes were real, but so was the connection. And in the quiet moments that followed, she recognized that trust, professional, personal and potentially romantic, was now an element of the game they were both playing. As she left the room, the weight of the revelation settled in her chest. The air between them was charged with unspoken acknowledgement. The subtle, magnetic tension that had threaded through their encounters now sharpened into something undeniable. She knew she had survived the test of the leak, but she also knew that this was only the beginning of a deeper, more intricate game, one where the rules were unspoken, the stakes high, and the attraction impossible to ignore. The office was quiet that evening, the golden hue of the sunset spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Alicia Keys sat at her desk, reviewing the final adjustments for the project that had nearly unraveled her career. Her mind, however, was not on charts, deadlines, or logistics. It was on him, Bryan Star. Even after the revelation of the leak and the vindication of her professional reputation, the awareness of his presence lingered in her body like a quiet, insistent hum. The pull was subtle yet undeniable, threading through her consciousness in every breath she took. The click of heels on the polished floor announced him before she saw him. Bryan approached, steady, deliberate, every movement measured, carrying the same gravity that had drawn her in since their first encounter. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he paused by her desk, his presence commanding attention without needing words. Alicia felt the subtle heat of it, the way her pulse responded to proximity, the awareness of every inch between them. It was magnetic, intoxicating, and undeniably charged. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, deliberate, and intimate, as though the office itself had shrunk to the space between them. "You've handled everything remarkably well," he said, a simple acknowledgement that carried layers of meaning. It was not just about the leak, the project, or the vindication. It was about her composure, her intelligence, and her capacity to navigate pressure under scrutiny. Alicia met his gaze, steadying herself against the pull she felt. "Thank you," she replied softly, aware that her voice betrayed a fraction of the racing heartbeat beneath her calm exterior. She sensed, as she had countless times, that every word, every movement, every glance was being measured, catalogued, and understood in ways that went beyond the professional. Bryan's eyes softened fractionally, a subtle shift that sent a ripple through her chest. He leaned slightly closer, the motion controlled but deliberate, closing just enough distance to make the air between them thick with unspoken meaning. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his tone low, careful, almost hesitant, a rare crack in the otherwise impenetrable armor he carried. Alicia's breath hitched imperceptibly. The confession she had been anticipating was not professional, not strategic. It was personal. She had felt the tension between them grow over weeks, simmering beneath every interaction, every glance, every moment of silent observation. And now, in the quiet of the office with the sun casting long shadows across the floor, she realized that the pull she had felt all along was mutual. "I didn't plan for this," he continued, his eyes holding hers with a depth that was almost unsettling. "I didn't plan on noticing you, not your career, not your skills, but you. The way you think, the way you respond, the way you move through the world with composure and grace. I wasn't looking for this, and yet here I am." The words struck her, each syllable resonating with a mix of surprise, curiosity, and undeniable attraction. Bryan Star, a man so controlled, so precise, so calculated in every aspect of his life, had allowed himself to be seen, truly seen by her. The realization sent a shiver along her spine, a quiet heat pooling in the center of her chest. I don't know what to say," Alicia admitted, her voice soft, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. She had been tested, observed, and challenged, and yet now the challenge was different. It was personal, emotional, and it was dangerous because it demanded a choice between safety and desire, between reason and the pull that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. Bryan stepped even closer, the subtle warmth of his presence brushing against her awareness, though not touching, not crossing the boundary he had carefully maintained. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. "I just needed you to know. Everything else, everything we've shared, all the tension, the tests, the observation, it's real, and it's not something I can ignore." Alicia felt the quiet weight of his confession settle over her, pressing against her chest, awakening instincts she had tried to control. It was not reckless, not sudden, not naive. It was adult, deliberate, and entirely consuming. The slow burn that had defined their interactions, the intellectual challenges, the subtle tension, the magnetic awareness, had crystallized into something tangible, something demanding recognition. She allowed herself a moment, her pulse quickening, her senses attuned to the faint electricity that lingered between them. The office around them faded into background noise. The sun dipped lower, casting shadows across the floor, highlighting the space between them that was now charged with unspoken agreement. Finally she spoke, her voice low but steady, deliberate yet tinged with vulnerability. I've felt it too," she admitted. "From the first moment in your office, in the meetings, in the way you watched me. I didn't know what it meant or what to do with it, but I've felt it." A faint smile touched his lips, a rare, almost private expression that softened the intensity of his presence. "Then we both know," he said, voice low, deliberate. "And now it's a choice. You can play it safe or you can trust it." Her chest tightened, awareness sharp, every nerve alive with the quiet heat of the moment. This was no longer a game of professional skill, observation, or subtle tests. This was real, dangerous, adult, and undeniable. Alicia realized, with a mixture of exhilaration and caution, that she had a choice. She could retreat, maintain safety, and preserve the professional boundaries she had carefully navigated. Or she could step fully into the magnetic, dangerous pull that Bryan Star represented, the slow burn, the intensity, the adult tension that neither had dared to name until now. She exhaled slowly, aware of the gravity of her decision. The room seemed to hold its breath, the fading sunlight stretching shadows across the floor, the air thick with anticipation. And in that quiet, suspended moment, Alicia understood something undeniable. She could no longer ignore what had been simmering between them. She could choose to trust him. Months had passed since the confession. The intensity between Alicia Keys and Bryan Star had remained, a quiet, simmering awareness that neither had ignored but both had allowed to grow at its own deliberate pace. Work had continued, projects launched, crises managed, and victories quietly celebrated. Yet the pull between them lingered, unspoken but undeniable, threading through each interaction like an invisible current that made her pulse quicken with every glance, every brush of proximity. That evening, Alicia found herself standing in front of the same estate that had introduced her to this dangerous, intoxicating world. The driveway was quiet, the gates closed, the manicured gardens casting long shadows under the warm glow of outdoor lighting. She hadn't been here on business in months. She hadn't come because she was sent, hadn't come by mistake. She had come because she wanted to, because she chose to. Her hand hovered over the doorbell for a moment, hesitation stirring in her chest. This was no longer an error, no longer a professional obligation. This was her decision. Her choice, and the gravity of it pressed on her with the same intensity she had first felt the night she delivered the wrong documents. The air around her seemed charged, alive with anticipation, almost as if the estate itself knew what was about to unfold. When the door opened, Bryan Star stood there. His expression was calm, measured, yet the slight curve of his lips and the intensity of his gaze betrayed the anticipation he, too, had felt. He did not need to ask why she was here. He had already known. He never needed words when presence alone communicated so much. Alicia met his gaze steadily, every nerve alive with awareness, every heartbeat tuned to the subtle energy radiating from him. This was no longer a professional collision, no longer a test of composure or skill. This was adult, deliberate choice, the culmination of months of tension, observation, and mutual recognition. He stepped aside, allowing her entry, and for a moment the silence between them was thick with anticipation. The familiar surroundings, the polished floors, the understated elegance, the aura of control that had always defined him, now felt different. It felt personal, intimate, a space they could claim together. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," he said finally, his voice low, deliberate, carrying warmth beneath the controlled surface. "I didn't come because I was sure," she replied, a subtle smile playing on her lips. "I came because I chose to." The words hung between them, heavier than any confession, more meaningful than any verbal declaration could ever be. The choice was theirs, fully adult, fully conscious, and fully mutual. Every step she had taken, every tension, every test, every challenge had led to this moment. And in that awareness, there was power, intimacy, and anticipation unlike anything either had experienced before. Bryan's eyes softened, and he closed the distance between them, though carefully, deliberately maintaining respect even within the charged tension of the moment. "Then we're on the same page," he murmured, and for the first time his tone carried no calculation, only acknowledgement, understanding, and quiet connection. Alicia felt the subtle pull in her chest, the slow, deliberate burn of attraction and trust intertwined. This was not reckless, not hurried, not naive. It was adult, deliberate, aware, and entirely consuming. She realized that the months of tension, observation, and careful navigation had not dulled the intensity. They had honed it, sharpened it, made it something entirely their own. They moved through the house together, neither speaking unnecessarily, each aware of the gravity and intimacy of shared space. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the resonance of choice, desire, and trust. Every glance, every subtle movement, every deliberate touch of proximity carried meaning. The slow burn they had cultivated over weeks of professional collisions and unspoken tension had reached a natural crescendo. Awareness and acknowledgement of mutual desire, fully adult and consensual, fully chosen. Finally, they stopped in the sitting room, the familiar space now transformed by presence and intention. Alicia looked at him, eyes steady, pulse racing, aware of every subtle shift in his posture, every nuanced expression. "I trust this," she said softly, letting the weight of the months and the unspoken understanding settle into words. "I trust us." Bryan's gaze softened, the last remnants of controlled authority melting into acknowledgement of choice, recognition, and connection. "Then we move forward together," he said, and the weight of the months, the tension, the slow burn, and the subtle, dangerous pull finally gave way to something entirely theirs. They stood together, fully aware of the risks, fully conscious of the intensity, and fully committed to the choice they had made. The slow burn, the tension, the anticipation, all crystallized in that moment, bringing an adult, deliberate, satisfying closure to months of suspense, intrigue, and unspoken attraction. As Alicia Keys finally stepped fully into the estate, no longer a visitor, no longer an intruder, she realized that this was more than a professional victory, more than vindication from rumors or threats. It was the culmination of awareness, choice, and slow-burn desire, a rare, deliberate, and wholly adult connection between two people who had navigated danger, tension, and professional stakes, and now chose each other fully, consciously, and without hesitation. The door closed behind them, not as a barrier, but as the beginning of something wholly theirs, charged with tension, desire, and the promise of intimacy that had been earned through patience, observation, and deliberate, adult choice.